I've tried to get into World of Warcraft 3 different times over the years, and every single time, I quit. Not because I hated it or thought it was a bad game. In fact, every time I played it, I could tell there was something special there. There's a reason this game has lasted for 2 decades and still has millions of people logging in every day. But every time I tried to log in and feel that same magic that everyone talks about, I felt like I was doing something wrong. World of Warcraft has always had this reputation. Even if you've never played it, you've probably heard of it. It's not just the world's biggest MMO. It's a revolutionary video game that can be argued as having legitimized gaming for the masses. WoW is the reason most of the mainstream even takes gaming seriously. But with that legacy also comes the massive raids, the endless systems, the mountains of lore, and the hardcore player base that seems to know absolutely everything about the game. When you're on the outside looking in, it's intimidating. It feels less like starting a new game and more like walking into a party that started 20 years ago, where everyone already knows each other, everyone understands the references, and everyone seems to know where to go and what to do. And you're just standing there thinking, wait, am I supposed to know what any of this means? My first real attempt was years ago during Legion, but being a player unwilling to drop money on the game quite yet, I played mostly in the free tier in the Warlords of Draenor expansion. I made a Blood Elf Hunter, started leveling, and actually got pretty far for a new player. I think I made it to around level 40. But the entire time I played, I had this feeling hanging over me like a cloud. I didn't know the lore or the systems, and especially I didn't know what I was supposed to be doing in the long term, so eventually I just stopped playing. A few years later, I tried again when Shadowlands was the current expansion, once again meddling in the previous expansion, Battle for Azeroth, on the free tier. I figured maybe this time would be different. I made a Demon Hunter, jumped into the starting area, played for a little while, and then I quit again. And after that, I kind of just accepted something. Maybe WoW just wasn't for me. Maybe I was too late. Maybe the game had already grown past the point where someone new could realistically jump in and feel comfortable. When a game has 20 years of history behind it, it's easy to assume that the only people who truly understand it are the ones who've been there the whole time. So, for a long time, I stopped trying. But recently, something changed. For the first time ever, I actually bought a World of Warcraft expansion. Not just to try it for a weekend, not just to poke around for nostalgia, but to actually sit down and play it seriously. That expansion was World of Warcraft Midnight. And somewhere along the way, something clicked. Because it turns out the thing that kept pushing me away from World of Warcraft for all these years wasn't the game itself. It was the idea in my head that I needed to understand everything before I was allowed to enjoy it. And once I let go of that idea, the game started to feel very different. Looking back now, the funny thing is that none of the times I quit World of Warcraft were really about the gameplay itself. The combat was fine, the world was cool, despite me never really being a fantasy nerd. Even back then I could tell the game had an incredible sense of scale. What actually pushed me away was the feeling that I had just opened a machine with 1,000 buttons, and nobody had given me the manual. The first time you log into WoW as a new player, the user interface alone is kind of overwhelming. You've got your action bars at the bottom, a minimap in the corner, bags filling up with items you don't understand yet, talent windows, character menus, quest logs, world maps, dungeon finders, profession panels, social menus. It just keeps going. And every one of those windows looks like it contains some important system that veteran players probably understand immediately. But when you're new, you're staring at it thinking, do I need to learn all of this right now? Because it doesn't feel optional. It feels like homework. It's in the game right here in front of me, so why wouldn't it be important if it's a system I can engage with? I mean, virtually every other game I've ever played has been like that. Blizzard must certainly expect me to use this immediately if they were shoving it in my face, right? Then there's the sheer list of things the game advertises to you as soon as you start learning more about it. People start talking about dungeons, raids, professions, crafting systems, pet battles, transmog, mount collecting, PvP, auction houses. The way those things are talked about among fans, it can make the game sound less like an adventure and more like a spreadsheet with dragons in it to a newcomer. So when I first tried WoW years ago, that list of systems intimidated me more than anything. It didn't look like a gameplay feature designed to be fun, but more so a skill check meant to weed out the casual players who can't hack it in Azeroth. Every time I heard about a new feature, my brain interpreted it as yet another thing I needed to learn and understand before I was quote-unquote playing correctly. And then there was, of course, the lore. World of Warcraft has a massive universe behind it, spanning not just the game's own 20-year history, but an additional 10-plus year history on top of it from the original Warcraft RTS games. If you're someone who enjoys deep fantasy storytelling, you may see that as one of the game's biggest strengths. But as a brand new player, especially one like me who never particularly gravitated towards mages and dragons, it can feel like someone handed you a fantasy novel and told you to start reading at chapter 700. You're hearing names like Thrall, Illidan, Sylvanas, Malfurion, places like Azeroth, Draenor, Outland, events that apparently happened in some cases thousands of years ago, spread out over a bunch of other expansions. If you're not already familiar with those things, you start feeling like you've missed something important. On top of that, let's face it, a lot of those names are not the easiest things in the world to pronounce or remember correctly the first time you read them. Hell, for most of my time with WoW pre-midnight, I couldn't tell you what the difference was between Quel'Thalas and Quel'Danas. So you end up in this weird situation where the story is clearly trying to prevent something dramatic or important, but because you don't have the context yet, it doesn't really land. And eventually, I fell into this habit where I stopped trying to follow it entirely. My gameplay loop basically became this. See the exclamation point, click the NPC, accept the quest, go kill 10 things, come back to the question mark, turn the quest in, rinse and repeat. Now, many veterans are probably nodding their heads right now saying, yeah, that is the core loop of WoW. And they're right. But the why behind those quests, the story, the characters, I wasn't connecting with any of it because I didn't read them, figuring I wouldn't understand what the hell was going on anyways. And because of that, the whole experience started to feel a little hollow. Like I was technically progressing through the game, but not really understanding the world I was moving through. Eventually that disconnect built up to the point where I just stopped logging in. Not because WoW was bad, but because I felt like I was only seeing the surface of something much bigger, and I had no idea how to get deeper into it. The biggest obstacle I had with World of Warcraft, though, wasn't actually the complexity of the game, it was the idea in my head that there was a correct way to approach it, and that I was already failing at it. A lot of that feeling came from the story, because the thing is, it's not like I knew nothing about WoW. Even before I seriously tried playing it, I had picked up fragments of the universe over the years just from being around gaming culture. I knew the big one, Alliance versus Horde, that was pretty much impossible to miss. I knew Sylvanas Windrunner mostly because I thought she looked cool. In fact, veteran viewers of my main channel might actually remember a very old, very cringe video I made years ago where I was so excited about interacting with Sylvanas in the game that I literally recorded a video of myself traveling across the map just to go see her. At the time, I thought it was the coolest thing ever, but looking back, yeah, it was kind of embarrassing. It's privated now for that very reason, but the point is, I knew who she was. I knew who Thrall was, too, partially because I knew he was voiced by Chris Metzen. If you follow Blizzard games for long enough, that name comes up a lot. I knew Arthas was the Lich King, I knew Anduin existed, I knew Jaina Proudmoore was an important character, even if I couldn't tell you exactly why. So it wasn't like I was completely lost, but all of that knowledge felt like random puzzle pieces from a massive picture I couldn't actually see. It's like someone handed me a handful of scenes from a 20-season TV show and said, here you go, you're caught up now. Technically, I recognized the characters, but I had no idea how their stories actually connected. And because of that, every time I tried to engage with the narrative, my brain went straight to the same thought. I'm missing too much. Which led to the next thought, if I'm missing too much, I'm probably playing this wrong. That mindset stuck with me for years, but then something interesting happened. As I was getting ready for my trip to BlizzCon 2026, I found myself rewatching the BlizzCon opening ceremony from 2023. Specifically the moment when Chris Metzen came back on stage and started talking about the World Soul Saga. And if you've seen that clip, you know exactly the energy I'm talking about. Medson's BlizzCon energy is kind of legendary, as he was a staple of the con for many years before his departure, shortly after the launch of Overwatch. And 2023 was the first year he was back helming WoW's story. Medson walks out, the crowd loses their minds, and he starts talking about this massive 3-expansion storyline that's going to define the next era of World of Warcraft. And I'll be honest, it got me hyped. Even as someone who had barely played the game, hearing the creator of the Warcraft universe talk about the future of the story like that made me want to understand what was going on. So, I opened up ChatGPT and I basically asked a very simple question, one only it would be able to answer without bias. How do I even begin to understand World of Warcraft's story? Because I assumed the answer was going to involve hours and hours of homework, lore videos, timeline breakdowns, maybe even going back and playing old expansions in order. Most games I've played have a complete narrative with a beginning, middle, and end, so I'm thinking I'll need to absorb it all to have any idea of what was going on. However, the answer I got back was something much simpler. It told me, you don't need to understand the entire story. You just need to understand the part of the story you're in. That was it. And when that idea finally clicked in my head, something shifted. Because up until that moment, I had been approaching WoW like it was a history exam. Like I needed to study everything that came before in order to appreciate what was happening now. But that's not actually how the game is designed. Each expansion tells its own story within the larger universe. Yes, those stories can connect to the past, but they're also written in a way that new players can jump in and follow what's happening in the present. Once I stopped worrying about the 20 years behind me and started focusing on the story right in front of me, the world suddenly became a lot easier to engage with. Instead of thinking, I don't understand any of this, I started thinking, okay, what's happening here? And that small shift in mindset made a massive difference, because for the first time, I wasn't trying to play World of Warcraft like a veteran. I was playing it like someone who had just arrived in the world. Another place where that I'm probably doing this wrong feeling previously showed up was right at the very beginning of the game. Character creation. For most players, that's the exciting part. You pick your race, you pick your class, you customize your character, and you jump into the world. But for me, even that felt like it was a decision that I could mess up. Over the years, I had absorbed a lot of secondhand advice from veteran players. That kind of advice that's usually meant to help beginners, but can accidentally make the game feel even more intimidating. One thing I heard consistently was that some classes just weren't beginner friendly. Death Knight, for example. It sounds awesome, but I remember hearing people say it was terrible for new players because of how complicated it was. And when Demon Hunters were introduced, I heard similar warnings. Cool class, but not something you should start with. So the message I internalized was pretty simple. If you're new, don't touch those. Which is funny in hindsight, because those were exactly the kinds of classes that immediately grabbed my attention. But instead of following my instincts, I tried to play it safe, figuring these guys knew best. My first real character was a Blood Elf Hunter, as I said, that I leveled up to around level 40 before quitting. Looking back, however, it's kind of amazing that I even made it that far, because at the time, the game didn't have Exile's Reach yet, which is now the modern starting experience for brand new players. You kinda just got dropped into the world in your race's starting zone and told to figure it out. When you combine that with a user interface full of menus and systems that you don't understand yet, it's really easy to feel like you're missing something important. Back then, I didn't really understand things like specializations, talent choices, or even what a lot of the windows were for. So it's entirely possible that I was picking abilities and options that didn't really match the way I wanted to play because I didn't know enough yet to make informed decisions. Fast forward to my most recent attempt at the game, and I decided to start fresh with a Blood Elf Rogue. At this point, I had heard a much healthier piece of advice from other players. Just pick something that looks cool. That's it. Demon Hunters still fit that bill for me, but my previous attempt to play them a few years back prior stuck out and reminded me that they quote-unquote weren't for new players. So, I made my rogue, played through Exile's Reach properly this time, and started leveling. I got that character up to around level 22, and chose a stealth-focused specialization. And honestly, the combat felt great. but the stealth mechanics themselves felt a little clunky to me. It wasn't bad, it just wasn't quite the playstyle I was looking for. So, shortly before the launch of World of Warcraft Midnight, I started looking around again to figure out what class I might want to commit to long term. There were a few things I knew for sure. First, I wanted to play Horde. Partially because the Horde races just look cooler to me, but also because I'm going to BlizzCon and, let's be honest, yelling, "For the Horde!" in a crowd of thousands just hits different. Second, I kept ending up back at Blood Elves. What can I say? Elves are cool. And third, I kept coming back to Demon Hunter. It just looked like the most exciting class in the game. The only thing holding me back was that voice in my head saying, "You know this class isn't for beginners, why bother?" So, I looked up a guide. And that's when I discovered something that genuinely surprised me. A lot of that old advice about demon hunters not being beginner friendly just isn't true. Not only was the class even cooler than I imagined with fast aggressive combat, insane mobility, double jumps, and gliding, but in fact many recent guides actually describe demon hunters as one of the most accessible classes in the game for beginners. The core abilities are straightforward, the mobility makes combat forgiving, and the overall gameplay loop is easy to understand while still being exciting. This was a massive relief, because it meant that the class I had been most drawn to from the beginning was actually a perfectly valid choice. So, I made my Blood Elf Demon Hunter. Her name was Synthera, and when I clicked the button to finish the customization and enter the game, for the first time in all my attempts to get into WoW, I felt a real connection to my character. This wasn't just a test run anymore. This was going to be my main for Midnight. I was certain of it. Ironically, the reason I had abandoned Demon Hunter years earlier had nothing to do with the class itself, it was because of where the game starts you off. Most classes begin at level 1 and now go through Exile's Reach, which acts as a proper tutorial up through around level 10. Demon Hunters are different. They start at level 8 inside the Legion expansion storyline instead. The first time that this happened to me, my immediate reaction was basically panic. Wait, I'm already level 8? I'm in the middle of some expansion storyline? I definitely wasn't supposed to pick this class. So I quit. But this time was different. Because I had already gone through Exile's Reach with my rogue and learned the basics of the UI, the quest system, and how my abilities worked, the switch to Demon Hunter was no longer as jarring. More importantly, I had let go of the idea that I needed to understand every piece of story context before I was allowed to move forward. So being dropped into the Legion intro didn't bother me anymore. It didn't matter if I fully understood what was happening in that moment. I could always go back through Legion later and get a better context. What mattered was that I understood how to play my character, and once that mental barrier disappeared, the entire experience started to click in a way it never had before. Another thing that used to intimidate me about World of Warcraft wasn't just the game itself, it was the players. WoW has this reputation, whether it's fair or not, of having an incredibly hardcore community. The kind of players who know every system, every optimal build, every raid mechanic, every piece of gear that drops from every boss. You see videos of mythic raids where 20 people are coordinating like a military operation. You hear people talking about mythic plus keystones, raid parses, crafting economies, auction house markets, and if you're brand new, it can make the whole game feel like you're about to step into an environment where everyone expects you to know what you're doing. Like there's some invisible standard you're supposed to meet before you're allowed to participate. That feeling kept me on the outside of the game for a long time, because every time I saw a high-level player running around in a full set of transmog gear with some giant glowing weapon, I'd immediately think, that's what a real WoW player looks like. And by comparison, I felt like someone who stuck out like a sore thumb as a filthy casual, and not one of those real players. But something started to change once I began leveling my Demon Hunter. I slowly realized that the game has a natural flow to it, and that flow makes a lot more sense when you stop looking at everything all at once. When you're leveling in World of Warcraft, your main job is actually very simple. Follow the story. That's it. Questing is the backbone of the leveling experience. The game is guiding you from one area to the next, introducing characters, telling the narrative of the expansion, and, especially in the early game, teaching you your class along the way. All of those other systems that seem so intimidating at first glance, like dungeons, raids, professions, crafting economies, the auction house, Mythic Plus, most of those are only things that really start to matter once you reach the endgame. They're not requirements for enjoying the journey. And once I realized that, a lot of the pressure I had been putting on myself just kind of disappeared. Suddenly, those huge menus that once felt overwhelming didn't seem so threatening anymore. They weren't urgent tasks, they were options. Things I could explore later at my own pace, when I was ready for them. Seeing a level 90 player running around in a full transmog set with gear from mythic raids didn't feel intimidating anymore. It just felt like seeing someone who had been playing longer than I had. And that's okay, because one of the things I started to appreciate about WoW is that the game really does give you the space to grow into it. You don't have to understand everything on day one. You don't have to jump straight into the most competitive parts of the game. You can just play through the story, learn your class, explore the world, and gradually discover the other systems as they become relevant. And eventually, if you want to be that player with the crazy gear and the complicated crafting setup and the mythic raid achievements, you can. But the game doesn't demand that from you right away. There will be time for that when you reach the level cap and start looking for new goals beyond questing. Realizing that changed the way I looked at WoW entirely, because the intimidating wall of systems I had been staring at for years suddenly turned into something much more manageable. Instead of feeling like 1,000 things I needed to understand immediately, it became a long list of things I could learn whenever I felt ready. Another thing that completely changed my perspective on World of Warcraft was experiencing an expansion launch for the first time. Up until now, every time I had tried the game, I was always jumping into the middle of something that had already been going on for years. Entire expansions had come and gone, the community had already dissected everything, and I was basically arriving to a conversation that everyone else had finished having years ago. But this time was different, because this time, I actually bought the upcoming expansion. This was a first for me, but man, that Chris Metzen is one hell of a salesman. Normally, when a new expansion releases, World of Warcraft updates the game so that new players can experience the previous expansion as part of the base game. For example, when Midnight was on the horizon and the War Within was the current expansion, players could level from around level 10 all the way up to the level cap through World of Warcraft Dragonflight without needing to buy anything extra. That's exactly what I was doing while I waited for Midnight to release. I had planned to buy just the base edition of the expansion and start playing when it officially launched. My Demon Hunter Synthera was ready to go, and the plan was simple: boost her to level 80 when Midnight dropped, and jump into the new story along with everyone else. But then the hype started getting to me. The closer launch day got, the more excited I was to finally experience the game the way so many longtime players had described it, being there when the new story actually begins. So eventually, I caved and upgraded to the Epic Edition for early access. Yes, it cost an extra $40, no, I am not proud of how quickly I gave in. But honestly, I don't regret it, because experiencing the expansion alongside the rest of the community was surreal. For the first time ever, I wasn't playing catch-up. Everyone was exploring the new zones together. Everyone was doing the same quests and discovering the story as it unfolded. I know there are people out there who already blasted through the entire campaign in the first few days. Some players just have the time and drive to push through content like that. But for me, the coolest part has been seeing other people talk about the same quests I've recently completed. I'll watch a video or read a discussion and suddenly realize, wait, I just did that quest, or I know where that is. And that feeling, recognizing moments in the story and world that the entire community is currently experiencing, made me feel like I was finally part of the conversation instead of years behind it. And the more I played through the campaign, the more something else became clear. Even though Midnight is part of the larger World Soul saga, it's still a very contained story. You really only need a small amount of context going in. There are a few major Warcraft characters you'll probably recognize if you spent any time around Blizzard games, but beyond that, the expansion introduces the characters and conflicts you need to understand as the story unfolds. And once I actually slowed down and took the time to read the campaign quests instead of skipping through them, I realized I could follow the story perfectly fine, even without decades of Warcraft knowledge. When I finally finished the campaign, my first initial thought was, holy shit, I can't wait till we get the last Titan. Once I not only realized how self-contained Midnight actually was, but how accessible of a jumping off point it was to the broader World Soul saga, something magical happened. What used to look like 20 years of expansions I needed to quote-unquote catch up on suddenly transformed into something completely different. Instead of a mountain I had to climb before I was allowed to participate, it became a massive library of stories I could explore whenever I wanted. Old expansions weren't homework anymore. They were optional adventures, stories I could go back and experience in whatever order I felt like, whenever I felt curious about them. And that realization led me to something that longtime WoW players probably already understood, but nobody had ever really said out loud in a way that clicked for me. World of Warcraft isn't a single story you have to complete. It's a world you get to exist in. How you experience Azeroth is entirely up to you. So, who is this video actually for? Because if you've been playing World of Warcraft for years, if you've been raiding in every expansion, pushing Mythic Plus, collecting mounts, min-maxing builds, a lot of what I've talked about here probably sounds obvious. Of course you don't need to know everything immediately. Of course new players can jump in. Of course the game teaches you as you go. But if you've been a part of the community for a long time, it's easy to forget what the game looks like from the outside. Because from the outside, World of Warcraft looks enormous. 20 years of expansions, hundreds of characters, systems stacked on top of systems, a player base that often seems like they've memorized the entire game. And if you're someone who has been curious about WoW, but hesitant to try it because of all that, this video is for you. If you've ever looked at the game and thought, I'm too late, if you've ever felt like you needed to spend weeks watching lore videos before even understanding what's happening, if you've ever worried that you'd start the game and immediately realize you had no idea what you were doing, I get it, because that was me. For years, the thing that kept me from enjoying World of Warcraft wasn't the game itself. It was the assumption that I had already missed my chance to be a part of it. But the truth is, WoW isn't something you have to catch up to in order to belong. You don't have to start at the beginning of the timeline. You don't have to understand every character. You don't have to participate in every system. You can just start. Pick a race that looks cool. Pick a class that looks fun. Follow the quests. Learn the game one step at a time. And if you do that, something really interesting starts to happen. The world stops feeling intimidating. It starts feeling familiar. Because World of Warcraft isn't just this monolithic game to complete. Azeroth is a world I now live in, and you can too. It's never too late to come home.